The dusty trail stretched before Owen Irving like a ribbon of broken promises. The Wyoming sun beating down merciless and unforgiving as his horse plodded toward South Pass City, with the weariness of a creature that knew its rider had nothing left to lose. Owen had been running cattle with a crew of 5 men for the better part of 3 months, pushing a herd from Texas up through Colorado and into Wyoming territory, where the grass grew sweet and the water ran cold from mountain streams. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild enough that a man could lose everything in a single moment of bad luck or bad judgment. Owen had lost his cook to pneumonia 2 weeks back, and since then, the men had been eating beans that tasted like boot leather and biscuits hard enough to break teeth. Morale was lower than a snake's belly, and if Owen did not find someone who could turn provisions into proper meals, he would lose his crew before the season ended. South Pass City rose from the sagebrush like a mirage made solid, its weathered buildings huddled together against the vastness of the landscape. Gold had brought people here back in the 60s, and though the boom had faded, enough folks remained to keep the town alive, if not exactly thriving. Owen guided his horse down the main street, past the assayer's office, the general store, and 2 saloons that faced each other like rivals preparing for a showdown. He needed supplies, information, and most desperately, someone who could cook. The general store smelled of tobacco, dried goods, and the particular mustiness that came from items sitting too long on shelves. Owen removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and dust. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with mutton chops that would have been impressive in any decade, looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" the man asked. "Need supplies," Owen said, pulling a list from his vest pocket. "And information. I am looking to hire a cook for my outfit." "Know anyone who might be interested?" The proprietor stroked his mutton chops thoughtfully. "Cook, you say? Might be you are in luck. There is a widow woman just outside town, been taking in laundry and sewing to make ends meet. Used to cook for the boarding house before old Mrs. Henderson passed, and the place closed down. Theodora Dalton is her name, lost her husband last winter to a mining accident. Owen felt something twist in his chest at that. He knew what loss looked like, had seen it carved into the faces of too many men and women out here where life was cheap and death came easy. "Where might I find Mrs. Dalton?" "Got a small place about a mile west of town, right where the creek bends." "Cannot miss it, only cabin out that way with blue shutters. Her husband painted them before he died." The proprietor paused, then added, "She is a decent woman. You treat her right, you hear." "I am not looking for anything but a cook," Owen said firmly. "That is what they all say," the proprietor muttered, but he began gathering the items on Owen's list. An hour later, Owen rode toward the cabin with blue shutters, his saddlebags heavy with supplies. The creek gurgled beside the narrow path, and cottonwood trees provided patches of shade that made the afternoon heat almost bearable. The cabin was small but well maintained, the blue shutters bright against the weathered logs. A vegetable garden grew beside it, orderly rows of plants that spoke of someone who planned for the future, even when the present looked bleak. Owen dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. Before he could knock, the door opened, and he found himself looking at a woman who made his prepared speech disappear from his mind like morning mist. Theodora Dalton was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something about her face that made a man want to keep looking. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, gray eyes that held caution and intelligence in equal measure, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but might remember given the right reason. She wore a simple calico dress, faded from washing but clean and neatly mended. Owen guessed she was somewhere in her mid-20s, young to be a widow but not uncommon in this hard country. "Mrs. Dalton?" Owen asked, remembering to remove his hat. "I am Theodora Dalton," she confirmed, her voice soft but steady. "What can I do for you, Mr. Irving?" "Owen Irving. I run a cattle operation about 10 miles north of here, and I am in desperate need of a cook. The man at the general store said you might be interested in the position." Something flickered in her eyes, hope maybe, or perhaps just the calculation of someone who had learned to weigh every opportunity against the cost. What would the position entail? "Cooking 3 meals a day for 6 men, myself included. We are camped along the Sweetwater River for the season. The work is hard but honest. I would pay $30 a month plus room and board. You would have your own tent for privacy, and I give you my word that you would be treated with complete respect." $30, Theodora repeated, and Owen saw her doing the mathematics in her head, adding up what that money could mean. "That is generous. My men are ready to mutiny over my cooking," Owen admitted with a slight smile. "I reckon good food is worth paying for. But I will be honest with you, Mrs. Dalton. It is rough living. We are not in town. There is no other woman in the camp. It would just be you and 6 cowboys, and while I vouch for every man on my crew, I understand if that is not a situation you are comfortable with." Theodora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving past Owen to the garden, the cabin, the creek beyond. "When my husband died," she said finally, "he left me with this cabin and $47 in debts I did not know he had accumulated. I have been taking in laundry and mending, but it is not enough. I am 3 months behind on those debts, and the men he owed are not the patient type. So you see, Mr. Irving, I do not have the luxury of being uncomfortable." The matter-of-fact way she said it, without self-pity or plea for sympathy, made Owen respect her immediately. "When can you start? How soon do you need me?" "Yesterday, if possible." For the first time, Theodora's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "Give me 2 hours to pack my things and arrange for my neighbor to watch the cabin." "I will help you load your belongings," Owen offered. "That would be appreciated," Theodora said, and stepped aside to let him in. The cabin's interior was as neat as its exterior, everything in its place, despite the obvious poverty. Owen saw the careful patches on the curtains, the way shelves held dishes and supplies organized with military precision, the small touches that made the space a home rather than just a shelter. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a daguerreotype of a young couple on their wedding day, the man standing stiff and formal beside a seated Theodora who looked impossibly young and hopeful. Owen looked away quickly, feeling like an intruder on private grief. Theodora packed efficiently, gathering clothes, a few precious books, cooking utensils that were clearly her own. She wrapped the daguerreotype carefully in a shawl and placed it at the top of her carpet bag. When she caught Owen watching, she said, "My husband's name was Samuel. He was a good man who made bad choices, but he was still a good man." "I am sure he was," Owen said, though he knew nothing of the sort. What he did know was that this woman had loved her husband despite his failings, and there was a kind of loyalty in that which commanded respect. They loaded her belongings onto Owen's horse, which eyed the extra weight with what Owen could have sworn was equine disapproval. Theodora spoke briefly with an older woman who lived in a cabin a quarter-mile away, making arrangements for the garden and the cabin's upkeep. Then she climbed up behind Owen on the horse, sitting side-saddle with her arms carefully not quite touching him, maintaining propriety even in the necessary closeness. The ride to the camp took the better part of 2 hours. Owen could feel Theodora's presence behind him, the way she held herself rigid and apart, and he wondered what she was thinking as they rode away from everything familiar. He had seen that look before on the faces of pioneers heading west, that mixture of fear and determination that came from knowing there was no turning back. "Tell me about your men," Theodora said as they followed the Sweetwater River north. "You said you vouch for them." "I do," Owen confirmed. "We have got Pete Harrison, been riding with me for 5 years. Good hand with horses and better with a rope. Tommy Martinez, young but learning fast, always got a joke to lighten the mood. The Fletcher brothers, Caleb and Daniel, steady as stone and twice as reliable. And old Henry Cook, who has been working cattle since before I was born and has forgotten more about ranching than most men ever learn." "No troublemakers?" Theodora asked, and Owen heard the real question beneath it. "No troublemakers," he assured her. "Any man who cannot treat a woman with respect does not ride for me. That is not just a promise, Mrs. Dalton. That is ironclad." "I believe you," Theodora said quietly, and Owen felt some of the tension leave her posture. The camp came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. 5 canvas tents were arranged in a rough semicircle around a stone fire ring, with the chuck wagon positioned nearby, and a rope corral holding the remuda of horses. Cattle dotted the grassland beyond, several hundred head grazing peacefully in the late afternoon light. Smoke rose from the fire where someone had attempted to start supper, and Owen could already smell the depressing aroma of beans burning. Pete Harrison spotted them first, rising from where he had been repairing a bridle to wave. "Boss is back," he called, and the other men emerged from various tasks to greet them. Owen helped Theodora dismount, acutely aware of the 5 pairs of eyes watching with undisguised curiosity. "Men," he said, "this is Mrs. Theodora Dalton. She is our new cook, and the first man who treats her with anything less than complete courtesy will be walking back to Texas. Are we clear?" A chorus of "yes, boss," and "sure thing," Owen answered him. "Mrs. Dalton," Owen continued, "these are the men I told you about. Pete, Tommy, Caleb, Daniel, and Henry." Each man nodded or touched his hat brim in greeting, their faces showing varying degrees of surprise, curiosity, and in Tommy's case, poorly concealed delight. Theodora met each gaze steadily, taking their measure the way Owen imagined she might evaluate meat at the butcher's shop. "Gentlemen," she said with a slight nod, "I hope you are not too particular about your meals, because I will cook what we have, and you will eat it or go hungry." Henry Cook let out a bark of laughter. "Madam, after 3 weeks of Owen's attempts at biscuits, I would eat just about anything and be grateful." "Hey now," Owen protested, but he was grinning. The tension he had felt, the worry that this might be a mistake, began to ease. Theodora had the kind of no-nonsense bearing that would serve her well out here. "Let me show you where you will be sleeping," Owen said, leading Theodora to a tent set slightly apart from the others. "I had Pete set this up this morning. It is not much, but it is private and the canvas is good. No leaks." Theodora ducked inside, and Owen followed with her bags. The tent held a cot with blankets, a small trunk for storage, and a lantern hanging from the center pole. Owen had added a piece of oilcloth on the ground to keep out dampness, and had even found an old mirror to hang from one of the tent poles. "It is fine," Theodora said, running her hand over the blankets. "Better than fine. Thank you, Mr. Irving." "Just Owen," he said. "We are not formal out here." "Then you should call me Theodora," she replied, beginning to unpack. Owen left her to settle in and went to assess the damage Pete had done to the evening meal. The beans were indeed burnt, and the coffee was thick enough to float a horseshoe. He dumped both pots and started over, acutely aware that this would be the last time he would have to pretend he knew what he was doing at the chuck wagon. 20 minutes later, Theodora emerged from her tent wearing a practical split skirt that allowed for easier movement, and a clean blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. She surveyed the camp kitchen with the eye of a general planning a campaign, then rolled up her sleeves another notch and got to work. Owen and his men watched in fascination as she took charge of the space. She reorganized the chuck wagon supplies, muttering to herself about the appalling lack of order. She evaluated their provisions and declared that someone needed to shoot a deer or an antelope soon because they could not live on beans and salt pork alone. She built up the fire with the efficiency of long practice and soon had multiple pots going, transforming their meager supplies into something that actually smelled like food. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" Tommy asked, watching her work with the adoration of a starving man seeing salvation. "My mother ran a boarding house in Ohio," Theodora replied, stirring something that was making Owen's stomach growl. "I could cook before I could write my own name. After we moved west and I married, I cooked for the boarding house in South Pass City for 3 years. You learn efficiency when you are feeding 20 miners on a limited budget. That first dinner was a revelation." Theodora served up beans that did not taste like leather, biscuits that were actually edible, and gravy that made strong men weak with gratitude. The men ate in reverent silence, and when Pete asked for seconds, Theodora smiled a small, satisfied smile that made Owen think she had not had much reason to smile lately. After dinner, the men scattered to their various evening tasks, and Owen helped Theodora clean up. They worked in companionable silence, and Owen found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the way she moved with practiced efficiency, the small furrow between her brows as she concentrated on scouring a pot. "Thank you for the opportunity," Theodora said as they finished. "I know I thanked you already, but I mean it. You cannot know what this means to me." "I think I can guess," Owen said quietly. "We all need a second chance sometimes. I am just glad I could offer you one." Theodora looked at him then, really looked at him, and Owen felt something shift in the air between them, something he could not quite name. Then she nodded good night and disappeared into her tent, leaving Owen standing by the dying fire trying to figure out what had just happened. The days fell into a rhythm. Owen and his men worked the cattle, moving them to fresh grass, checking for illness or injury, planning for the drive to market that would come in the fall. Theodora presided over the camp with quiet competence, turning limited supplies into meals that kept the men happy and well fed. She proved to have opinions about camp organization, and Owen found himself deferring to her judgment on matters ranging from where to store the flour to the best way to dry laundry in the Wyoming wind. She fit into their routine like she had always been there, and the men treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Tommy was a little bit in love with her, in the harmless way of a 20-year-old who thinks every woman over 25 is impossibly sophisticated. Pete and the Fletcher brothers treated her like a favorite sister. Henry, who had daughters back in Texas he had not seen in years, sometimes got a faraway look when Theodora laughed at one of his stories. But it was Owen who found himself watching her when he thought she would not notice. The way she hummed while she cooked, songs he did not recognize that spoke of a life before this one. The way she tucked stray hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she stood at the edge of camp sometimes in the evening, looking west toward the mountains with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made his chest ache. 3 weeks after Theodora arrived, Owen rode into camp after a long day checking fence lines to find her sitting by the fire with tears streaming down her face. The other men were conspicuously absent, having made themselves scarce with the instinct of men who did not know how to handle a crying woman. Owen dismounted quickly and approached her, his heart hammering. "Theodora, What is wrong? Did something happen? Did one of the men? No, she said quickly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. No, nothing like that. I am sorry. I am being foolish. You are not being foolish, Owen said, crouching beside her. Tell me what is wrong. Theodora took a shaky breath. I got a letter today. Pete rode into town for supplies and brought back mail. It was from the bank in South Pass City. They are foreclosing on my cabin. They are selling it to cover Samuel's debts. I knew it was coming, but seeing it written out like that. She trailed off, her voice breaking. Owen felt anger rise hot in his chest. Anger at a dead man who had left his wife to face consequences he would never have to bear. Anger at a system that would take everything from a woman who had already lost so much. That is not right, he said. It is the law, Theodora replied with bitter resignation. Samuel signed notes he could not pay. The money is owed. I should be grateful they waited this long. How much? Owen asked. What? How much is owed? Theodora shook her head. It does not matter. I do not have it. How much, Theodora? $237, she said quietly. I might as well say $1 million for all the difference it makes. Owen stood, his mind working through numbers. $237 was a substantial sum, but not impossible. He had been saving to expand his herd, money tucked away in a bank in Cheyenne. The expansion could wait. I will give you the money, he said. Theodora looked up at him with wide eyes. What? No, absolutely not. Why not? Because I cannot possibly pay you back, because it would not be proper. Because... She stopped, searching for reasons. Because you are too proud to accept help, Owen suggested gently. Theodora, I am not offering charity. Consider it an advance on your wages. You can pay me back over time. At $30 a month, it would take me 8 months to repay you, and that is if I spend nothing on myself. So take 8 months. Take a year. Take however long you need. Owen sat down beside her. My father used to say that money is only worth what you do with it. I can expand my herd or I can help someone who needs it. Right now, you need it more than I need more cattle. I do not understand why you would do this, Theodora said, but Owen could see hope warring with caution in her eyes. Because it is the right thing to do, Owen said simply. And because you deserve a place that is yours, something secure. Everyone deserves that much. Theodora was quiet for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took Owen's hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you, she whispered. I do not have adequate words, but thank you. Owen looked down at their joined hands and felt something warm unfurl in his chest, something dangerous and hopeful and terrifying all at once. He squeezed back, then released her hand before he could do something foolish like never let go. The next day, Owen rode to South Pass City and paid Theodora's debt in full. The banker, a pinch-faced man who clearly disapproved of Owen's involvement, nevertheless accepted the payment and provided a receipt showing the debt satisfied. Owen rode back to camp with the document in his pocket, feeling lighter than he had in months. When he gave Theodora the papers that night after dinner, she held them like they were made of glass. The cabin is mine, she said wonderingly. Truly mine. Truly yours, Owen confirmed. No one can take it from you. I will pay you back every cent, Theodora said fiercely. I swear it. I know you will, Owen said, though in truth he would have forgiven the debt entirely if she asked. But he understood that she needed the dignity of repayment, the independence of knowing she had earned back her freedom. That night, Owen lay in his bedroll staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent and admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny for weeks. He was falling in love with Theodora Dalton. He loved the way she stood up to his men when they got rowdy, the way she sang while she cooked, the way she looked at the mountains like they held answers to questions she had not yet learned to ask. He loved her resilience and her sorrow, her strength and her vulnerability, the whole complicated reality of her. But she was a widow, still grieving a husband who had been dead less than a year. She was an employee, dependent on Owen for her wages. Any advance he made would be inappropriate at best, coercive at worst. So Owen did what men had done since time immemorial when faced with feelings they could not act upon. He buried them deep and tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. Theodora, for her part, was fighting her own battle. She had not expected to feel anything beyond gratitude toward Owen Irving, but somewhere between his steady kindness and his quiet strength, gratitude had transformed into something far more dangerous. She found herself looking for him in the mornings, listening for his voice in the evening, inventing reasons to speak with him that had nothing to do with camp business. She told herself it was too soon, that Samuel had been dead less than a year and her grief was still fresh. She told herself it was impractical, that Owen was her employer and anything between them would be complicated and inappropriate. She told herself that she could not trust her feelings, that gratitude and loneliness could masquerade as love and lead a woman astray. But none of that changed the way her heart lifted when Owen smiled at her, or the way time seemed to slow when they worked side by side. None of it changed the fact that she was falling in love with him, despite every sensible reason not to. Summer deepened. The days grew long and hot, and the evenings brought relief in the form of cool breezes down from the mountains. The cattle fattened on good grass, and Owen began planning for the drive to market in Rawlins. Theodora's cooking improved from good to exceptional, as she learned to work with Dutch ovens and open fires, coaxing flavors from simple ingredients that made every meal an event. The men noticed the way Owen and Theodora orbited each other like binary stars, aware of each other even when they were not looking. Pete and Henry exchanged knowing looks. Tommy asked Daniel if he thought the boss was sweet on the cook, and Daniel told him to mind his own business but privately thought Tommy was absolutely right. One evening in late July, a storm rolled in from the west with the inevitability of fate. The sky turned the color of an old bruise, and lightning spider webbed across the clouds. The cattle grew restless, and Owen ordered the men to mount up and keep them calm. A stampede in this weather could scatter the herd across half of Wyoming. "Theodora, get in your tent and stay there," Owen ordered as he swung into his saddle. "This is going to be bad." "Be careful," Theodora called after him, and the naked worry in her voice made Owen look back. Their eyes met across the camp, and something unspoken passed between them, something that felt like a promise or maybe a prayer. Then, Owen was riding into gathering darkness, and Theodora was left to wait. The storm hit with the fury of divine wrath. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to mud and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Thunder cracked like the world splitting open, and the cattle bawled in terror. Owen and his men worked desperately to keep the herd together, their horses fighting through the mud and darkness. Theodora huddled in her tent, listening to the chaos outside and praying harder than she had since Samuel died. She prayed for the men's safety, for the horses and cattle, and most fervently for Owen, which she told herself was only natural given that he was her employer, and the man who had saved her from destitution, and not at all because the thought of him being hurt made her feel like her heart was being crushed in a vice. Hours passed. The storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering. Lightning struck a tree at the edge of camp, splitting it with a sound like a cannon shot. Theodora jumped, her hands shaking as she lit her lantern against the darkness. Finally, when false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, she heard the sound of horses returning. Theodora stumbled out of her tent into the mud, not caring about propriety or appearance, needing to see with her own eyes that Owen was safe. The men rode in like ghosts, soaked to the skin and exhausted. Pete's arm was bleeding from a gash he had gotten from a tree branch. Tommy was limping, having been kicked by a panicked steer. But they were all alive, and the cattle, though scattered, were mostly accounted for. Owen dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had pushed himself past endurance. Mud covered him from head to foot, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. But he was alive and whole, and Theodora felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching him before she could think better of it. "No," Owen said, his voice hoarse. "Just tired and wet, so damned wet." "Come on," Theodora said, taking his arm. "All of you come to the fire. I will heat water and make coffee. You need to get warm." She bullied the exhausted men into changing into dry clothes, tended Pete's arm with steady hands despite having no formal medical training, and served them coffee so strong it could strip paint. She made breakfast even though none of them thought they were hungry, and when they tasted her biscuits and gravy, they ate like starving wolves. Owen watched her work with something approaching awe. This woman who had been broken and grieving when he found her had somehow become the backbone of their little operation. She was fierce and capable and utterly fearless, and God help him, he was completely in love with her. When the other men had finally collapsed in their tents to sleep away the aftermath of the storm, Owen remained by the fire, too keyed up to rest. Theodora sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You should sleep," she said quietly. "I will," Owen replied. "In a minute." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. The sun was fully up now, painting the clouds gold and pink, turning the rain-washed world into something clean and new. "I was terrified," Theodora said suddenly. "Last night during the storm. I was terrified something would happen to you." Owen turned to look at her, his heart suddenly pounding harder than it had during the entire night of chaos. "Theodora, I know I should not feel this way," she continued, not meeting his eyes. "I know it is too soon and too complicated and probably foolish besides. But I cannot help it, Owen. I care about you, more than I should, more than is wise." "Why is it not wise?" Owen asked, his voice rough. "Because you are my employer. Because my husband has been dead less than a year. Because I am damaged goods, a widow with debts and grief and nothing to offer." Theodora's voice broke on the last words. Owen reached out and gently turned her face toward his. "You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the strongest person I have ever met. I see someone who faced losing everything and did not break. I see a woman who can quiet rowdy cowboys with a look and turn beans and salt pork into something worth living for. I see someone I have been falling in love with since the day I watched you pack up your life in 2 hours and ride into uncertainty without flinching." "Owen," Theodora whispered, and there were tears in her eyes. "I know it is complicated," Owen said. "I know the timing is not ideal. But Theodora, I am not asking you to make any promises or decisions right now. I'm just asking you to know that I care about you, that I will wait as long as you need me to wait, that if you never feel the same way I do, I will still consider knowing you one of the great privileges of my life." Theodora laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and tears. "You do not have to wait. I already feel the same way. I have been fighting it for weeks, telling myself all the reasons I should not care for you. But the heart does not listen to reason, does it?" "No," Owen agreed. "It really does not." They leaned toward each other, and their first kiss was gentle, tentative, flavored with smoke and coffee and the promise of something new. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "What do we do now?" Theodora asked. "We take it one day at a time," Owen said. We figure it out together." "Together," Theodora repeated, and the words sounded like hope. The next weeks were a revelation. Owen and Theodora did not announce their relationship to the men, but they did not hide it either. They were careful to maintain professionalism during work hours, but in the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Owen told her about growing up on a ranch in Montana, about parents he had lost to influenza, about the dream of building something lasting in this wild country. Theodora told him about Ohio and the journey west, about her mother's boarding house, about Samuel and the complicated love she had felt for a man who could not seem to make good choices no matter how hard he tried. "I loved him," she told Owen one night under a sky full of stars. "But it was the love you have for someone you are trying to save, not the love between equals. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense," Owen said, holding her hand, "and it does not diminish what you felt or what he meant to you." "I think I needed to hear that," Theodora said quietly. As August arrived, Owen began preparations for driving the cattle to market in Rawlins, a journey that would take several days. It would require most of his men, leaving the camp vulnerable. After much discussion, they decided that Theodora would stay behind with Henry, who was too old for the hard riding a cattle drive required, and Tommy, whose injured leg still pained him. Owen hated leaving her, even for a few days. The night before the drive, he and Theodora walked along the creek, following its silver path in the moonlight. "I will be back in a week," Owen promised. 10 days at most." "I know," Theodora said. "I am not worried." "Liar," Owen said with a smile. "Maybe a little worried," she admitted. "But I trust you, Owen. I trust you to come back." They stopped walking and Owen pulled her close. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now. "I know we have not known each other long, but I am sure about this, about you, about us." "I love you too," Theodora whispered against his chest. "When did that happen? When did you become the most important person in my life?" "I could ask you the same question." They kissed under the stars, and when they finally returned to camp, they found Henry and Tommy studiously ignoring them, giving the couple their privacy. The cattle drive departed at dawn, Pete and the Fletcher brothers hazing the herd south while Owen rode point. Theodora watched them go with her hand shading her eyes, and she did not turn away until the dust had settled and the cattle were specks on the horizon. "He will be fine," Henry said from beside her. "Owen knows what he is doing." "I know," Theodora said. "That does not stop me from worrying." The days without Owen felt strangely empty despite the work that needed doing. Theodora cooked for Henry and Tommy, maintained the camp, and tried not to watch the southern horizon for signs of returning riders. Henry regaled her with stories of 40 years of ranch work, and Tommy taught her how to play poker, though she suspected he let her win more often than was strictly necessary. On the 5th day, riders appeared from the east instead of the south. 3 men on worn horses, their clothes dusty and their faces hard. Theodora felt her stomach clench with instinct that said these were not friendly visitors. Henry must have felt it too, because he casually moved closer to where his rifle leaned against the chuck wagon. Tommy straightened from the fence he had been mending, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. The 3 men rode into camp with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. The leader was a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and eyes the color of dirty ice. He looked around the camp with undisguised interest, his gaze lingering on Theodora in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now," the scarred man said, "what have we here? Looks like you folks are running a nice little operation." "We are working," Henry said, his voice neutral. "What can we do for you gentlemen?" "Gentlemen," one of the other men repeated with a laugh. Hear that, Jake? He called us gentlemen. Jake, the scarred man, did not laugh. We are just passing through looking for work. Thought maybe you could use a few extra hands. Boss is not hiring right now, Henry said. But there is a ranch about 20 miles east, Circle K outfit. They might have something. That is a shame, Jake said, his eyes on Theodora. Real shame. You the camp cook, sweetheart. Theodora lifted her chin, refusing to show the fear coursing through her. I am Mrs. Dalton, the cook for this outfit, yes. Mrs. Dalton, Jake repeated mockingly. Your husband around, Mrs. Dalton? I am a widow, Theodora said, immediately wishing she had lied. A widow, Jake said, and his smile made Theodora think of wolves. Even more of a shame. Pretty woman like you, all alone out here except for an old man and a kid. Dangerous country for a woman on her own. Tommy's face flushed red. You need to move along, he said, his hand hovering over his pistol. We got nothing for you here. Easy, boy, Jake said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. We are just being friendly. No harm in that, is there? There is when your friendly looks like a threat, Henry said, and there was steel in his voice now. I am going to ask you once more to ride on. Next time I ask, it will be with this rifle. For a moment, tension stretched tight enough to snap. Jake's eyes narrowed, calculating odds. 3 men against 2, but Henry's rifle was in his hands now, and Tommy, young as he was, looked ready to fight. And there was the unknown variable of when the rest of the crew might return. No need for trouble, Jake said finally. We will be on our way. But you might want to tell your boss that this is dangerous country. All kinds of accidents can happen. Fires, stampedes, people getting hurt. A man should be careful about what he leaves unprotected. The threat was clear. Jake tipped his hat in a gesture of false courtesy, and the 3 men rode out of camp, heading west toward the mountains. When they were out of sight, Theodora released a breath she had not known she was holding. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to still them. You did good, Henry said gently. Stood right up to them. I was terrified, Theodora admitted. Being brave does not mean not being scared, Henry said. It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. You got the spine for this life, Theodora. Do not let nobody tell you different. But the encounter left a shadow over the camp. Henry insisted that Theodora sleep in the supply tent, which was more defensible, and Tommy took to sleeping across the entrance with his rifle beside him. They kept watches through the night, though the 3 men did not return. When Owen and the others rode back into camp 6 days after they had left, Theodora barely waited for him to dismount before telling him what had happened. She saw Owen's face go hard and dangerous as she described the encounter. Jake with a scar on his eyebrow, Pete said when Owen relayed the description. That would be Jake Morrison. He rides with a gang that has been working their way through Wyoming territory, rustling cattle, robbing stages. They are bad news, boss. They threatened this camp, Owen said flatly. They threatened Theodora. That is not acceptable. What are you going to do? Caleb Fletcher asked. I am going to make sure they understand that this camp is protected, Owen said. Tomorrow we ride to South Pass City and talk to the sheriff. If Morrison and his men are wanted, maybe we can get some law involved. If not, we make it clear that they need to move on to someone else's territory. But that night, before anything could be done, the Montana gang struck. They came in the dark hours before dawn when sleep was deepest and reaction slowest. Theodora woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting, to the smell of smoke and the thunder of hooves. She grabbed the dress she had been using as a pillow and stumbled out of the supply tent to chaos. The horse corral had been cut open, and the remuda was scattering into the darkness. Someone had set fire to 2 of the sleeping tents. Owen and his men were returning fire at muzzle flashes in the darkness, trying to defend the camp against attackers they could barely see. "Theodora, get down." Owen's voice, sharp with fear. She dropped behind the chuck wagon just as a bullet splintered wood above her head. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was not the romantic West of dime novels. This was real violence, real danger, and she could die here in the dirt, killed by men she did not know for reasons that had nothing to do with her. The fight seemed to last forever, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the attackers withdrew, melting back into the darkness as quickly as they had come, leaving chaos in their wake. When Owen was sure they were gone, he ran to where Theodora crouched behind the wagon. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her shoulders, her arms checking for injuries. "No," Theodora said, though her voice shook. "No, I am fine. Is everyone?" "Tommy took a bullet in the shoulder," Owen said grimly. "Not fatal, but he needs a doctor." They got most of the horses and set fire to 2 tents. Could have been worse, but it is bad enough. By the time the sun rose, they had assessed the damage. Tommy was pale and in pain but stable. Henry had bandaged the wound as best he could, but the young man needed proper medical attention. They had lost 12 horses, a significant portion of their remuda. 2 tents were destroyed, and supplies had been scattered or stolen. "They will be back," Pete said. "This was just them testing our defenses. Next time they will hit harder." Owen looked around at his depleted, exhausted crew and made a decision. "We are moving the operation. There is a box canyon about 15 miles from here, good grass and water and only one way in. We can defend it if we have to. Pete, you and Daniel get Tommy to the doctor in South Pass City. Caleb, Henry, start gathering what cattle you can find. Theodora and I will pack up the camp." Everyone moved with the efficiency of people who understood the stakes. Within hours, the camp was struck and loaded onto the chuck wagon. Theodora worked alongside Owen, neither of them speaking much, both understanding that their lives had fundamentally changed in the space of a few violent minutes. As they worked, Owen said quietly, "I am sorry. I brought you here, promised you would be safe, and look what happened." "This is not your fault," Theodora said firmly, "and I am not leaving if that is what you are worried about." "You should leave," Owen said. "Go back to your cabin in South Pass City. You would be safer there." "I am not leaving you," Theodora said, stopping to look at him directly. "Do you understand? I am not leaving. We face this together or not at all." Something in Owen's expression cracked, the careful control he had been maintaining. He pulled her close, heedless of propriety or who might see. "I cannot lose you," he said against her hair. "When I heard that gunfire, when I thought they might have hurt you, I am here," Theodora said, holding him just as tightly. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." The box canyon proved to be everything Owen had hoped. High rock walls on 3 sides created a natural fortress, and the entrance was narrow enough that 2 men could hold it against a much larger force. There was good grass for the cattle, and a spring that provided fresh water year-round. Previous occupants had left a crude cabin at the back of the canyon, weathered but sound, with a stone fireplace and shutters on the windows. They spent 2 days establishing the new camp and rounding up scattered cattle. Pete and Daniel returned with the news that Tommy would recover fully, though he would need several weeks to heal. They also brought word from the sheriff in South Pass City. "Sheriff Wilson," says Jake Morrison, "and his gang are wanted in 3 territories," Pete reported. "There is a $500 reward for information leading to their arrest. He said he would send deputies if we needed them, but he does not have many men to spare." "We will handle this ourselves," Owen said, "but it is good to know the law is on our side if it comes to that." That night, Owen and Theodora stood at the entrance to the canyon, looking out at the Wyoming darkness. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama. "You ever wonder if we are crazy?" Theodora asked, "fighting so hard for something so uncertain." "Every day," Owen admitted. "But then I look at what we are building here, what we could have together, and I think it is worth the fight." "What are we building?" Theodora asked softly. Owen turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "I think we are building a life. I think we are building a future. And Theodora, if you will have me, I would like to make it official. I want you to be my wife." Theodora stared at him, her heart in her throat. "Are you proposing to me in the middle of being attacked by outlaws?" "I know the timing is terrible," Owen said with a crooked smile. "But I have learned that life does not wait for the perfect moment. I love you. I want to spend whatever time I have on this earth making you happy. So yes, I am proposing in the middle of being attacked by outlaws. What do you say?" "I say yes," Theodora said, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, you crazy man. Yes." They kissed under the stars, and for a moment the danger and uncertainty fell away, leaving only the certainty of their love. The attack they expected came 3 days later. Jake Morrison and his gang, emboldened by their previous success, tried to force their way into the canyon just after dawn. But this time, Owen and his men were ready. The narrow entrance became a killing field, and when the outlaws realized they were facing determined resistance from a defensible position, they withdrew with casualties. Owen did not pursue them. He had defended his people and his land, and that was enough. The message was clear. This outfit was not easy prey, but the conflict had a cost. Caleb Fletcher had taken a bullet in the leg, not serious but painful. Supplies were running low after the raid had destroyed so much, and the constant vigilance was wearing on everyone's nerves. A week after the second attack, a detachment of U.S. Marshals rode into the canyon. They had been tracking Morrison's gang across 3 territories and had finally caught up with them at a camp 30 miles north. There had been a brief firefight. Morrison and 2 of his men were dead. The rest were in custody. "You folks can rest easy now," the lead marshal said. "That gang will not be troubling anyone again." The relief was palpable. That night, the crew celebrated with a feast of Theodora's cooking, and Whiskey Pete had been saving for a special occasion. The mood was jubilant, the kind of joy that comes from surviving something difficult and coming out the other side. In the midst of the celebration, Owen stood and cleared his throat. "I have an announcement. Theodora has agreed to marry me. We will be having the wedding in South Pass City as soon as we can arrange it, and you are all invited." The men erupted in cheers and congratulations. Henry insisted on toasting the couple with glasses of whiskey that made Theodora's eyes water. Pete declared he would be the best man, even though Owen had not asked him yet. Daniel Fletcher offered to play fiddle at the wedding, a talent no one had known he possessed. Later, when the celebration had died down and the men had drifted off to their bedrolls, Owen and Theodora sat together by the fire. "Are you sure about this?" Theodora asked. "Marrying someone like me, a widow with nothing to bring to the marriage except debts and grief?" "I am marrying the woman I love," Owen said firmly. "Everything else is just details. And you do not have nothing, Theodora. You have strength and courage and a heart that keeps loving even when it has been broken. Those are worth more than any dowry. When did you become such a romantic?" Theodora teased, but her eyes were wet. "When I met you," Owen said simply. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in South Pass City. Theodora wore a dress of dove-gray silk that the women of the town had helped her make, a compromise between the white she could not wear as a widow remarrying and the dark colors that would have been too somber. Owen wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed within an inch of its life. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Owen's men filled the pews, along with neighbors from nearby ranches and townspeople who had known Theodora during her time as a resident. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was profound and approving. "I do," Owen said when asked, his voice steady and sure. "I do," Theodora echoed and felt the last pieces of her broken heart mend. They kissed to enthusiastic applause, and then the entire congregation moved to the town hall for a celebration that featured food, dancing, and more toasts than Theodora could count. She danced with Owen, with Pete, with old Henry, with Tommy, whose shoulder had healed enough to allow limited movement. She laughed until her sides hurt and felt lighter than she had in years. As the evening drew to a close, Owen took her hand and led her outside, away from the noise and celebration. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, and stood looking at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. "Happy?" Owen asked. "Deliriously," Theodora said. "I did not think I could be this happy again. After Samuel died, I thought that part of my life was over." "It was over," Owen said. "That chapter ended, but this is a new chapter, Theodora, our chapter, and we get to write it however we want." They had rented a room at the hotel for the night, a rare luxury of privacy and comfort. Later, lying in Owen's arms in the darkness, Theodora thought about the path that had brought her here. Loss and grief, debts and desperation, the terrifying leap of faith to join Owen's crew. And through it all, the slow blooming of love, unexpected and transformative. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Owen replied. "Always." They returned to the canyon the next day, and life took on a new rhythm. Theodora was now not just the cook, but the owner's wife, a distinction that changed surprisingly little in practical terms but everything in emotional ones. She had a partner now, someone to share burdens and joys, someone who saw her not as damaged or lesser, but as exactly who she was meant to be. The cattle operation flourished. The crisis with Morrison's gang, though costly, had proven the crew's resilience and determination. Word spread that Owen Irving ran a tight outfit that could hold its own against trouble, and that reputation brought business. By the time winter approached, they had expanded the herd and were planning for an even bigger drive the following year. As the first snows began to dust the mountains, Owen and Theodora made plans for the winter. The crew would stay in the Box Canyon, which provided excellent shelter from the worst of Wyoming's weather. They winterized the cabin, chinked gaps in the walls, and laid in supplies for the months when travel would be difficult or impossible. On a cold November evening, Theodora stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Owen and Pete repair a section of fence before the light failed completely. She felt a familiar queasiness that had been plaguing her for the past few weeks and smiled to herself, one hand going to her still flat belly. She had not told Owen yet. She wanted to be absolutely sure, and besides, the moment needed to be right. But as she watched her husband work, his breath misting in the cold air, she felt a surge of love so intense it made her breathless. They would have a child. A new life, a symbol of hope and the future they were building together. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. That night after dinner, when the rest of the men had retired to their tents, and she and Owen had the cabin to themselves, Theodora decided the time was right. "Owen," she said as they sat before the fire, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the harness he was mending, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "Not unwell exactly," Theodora said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "But there will be some changes. We will need to make room in the cabin, perhaps build a cradle." It took Owen a moment to understand. When comprehension dawned, his face went through a series of expressions so rapidly Theodora almost laughed. Shock, disbelief, joy, and finally a kind of wonder. "A baby," he breathed. "We are having a baby in the spring, I think," Theodora confirmed. "April or May." Owen crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. "A baby," he repeated. "Theodora, are you happy? Is this?" "I am happy," she assured him. "I am terrified too, but I am happy." "I will take care of you," Owen promised, his face buried in her hair. "Both of you. I will build a bigger house, hire more help, whatever you need." "I do not need a bigger house," Theodora said, laughing. "Though perhaps you could build that cradle you are so fond of." They stayed up late into the night, making plans and dreaming about the future. Owen wanted to know if she hoped for a boy or a girl. Theodora said she did not care as long as the baby was healthy. Owen worried about the isolation, whether they should move into town for the winter so Theodora would be closer to a doctor. Theodora insisted she would be fine, that women had been having babies in less comfortable circumstances since the dawn of time. Winter settled over Wyoming with the finality of a door closing. Snow piled deep in the valleys and turned the world into a monochrome study of white and gray. The crew hunkered down, focusing on keeping the cattle fed and the camp running. Theodora's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in ways both wonderful and uncomfortable. She continued to cook, though Owen and the men increasingly insisted on helping. She would not be allowed to lift anything heavy or stand too long at the fire. Pete, it turned out, had a surprising knack for baking and took over the bread-making duties. Henry appointed himself Theodora's personal assistant, always hovering to make sure she did not overexert herself. "I am pregnant, not dying," Theodora protested after Henry intercepted her carrying a pot of stew. "And we aim to keep it that way," Henry said firmly. "You just sit and supervise. That is plenty of work right there." Despite her protests, Theodora found herself touched by their care. These rough men, more comfortable with cattle and horses than human emotion, treated her like precious cargo. It was humbling and heartwarming in equal measure. As winter deepened, Owen spent his evenings by the fire, carving. The cradle took shape slowly, crafted from pine he had carefully selected and seasoned. He worked with a concentration that was almost meditative, creating something beautiful for his child. Theodora would watch him work, her hands resting on her growing belly, and feel grateful for the strange path that had brought them together. In January, a blizzard struck with such ferocity that they could not see from the cabin to the nearest tent. They huddled inside for 3 days while the storm raged, the crew taking turns tending the livestock in the brief moments when visibility allowed. Theodora worried constantly about the cattle, the horses, the men risking their lives in the storm. When it finally passed, they emerged to find the world transformed. Snow drifts reached the cabin's eaves. Several cattle had perished despite their best efforts, frozen where they stood. It was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of this land, but they endured. They dug out, tended the survivors, and carried on because that was what people did in this country. You faced what came and dealt with it and kept moving forward. By February, Theodora was visibly pregnant, her belly round and prominent. The baby moved constantly, kicks and rolls that fascinated Owen to no end. He would rest his hand on her stomach, feeling their child move with an expression of such wonder that it made Theodora fall in love with him all over again. "You think it is a boy or a girl?" Owen asked one night. "Does it matter?" Theodora replied. "Not even a little bit," Owen said, kissing her belly. "As long as you are both healthy, I do not care if it is a boy, a girl, or a pronghorn antelope." Theodora laughed. I think I can safely promise it will not be a pronghorn antelope." As the days slowly lengthened and the first hints of spring began to appear, Theodora felt both anticipation and anxiety building. She was as prepared as she could be. They had sent for a midwife from South Pass City, who had agreed to come stay at the camp when Theodora's time grew close. Owen had made multiple trips to town, gathering supplies and advice. But still, the unknown loomed large. The midwife, Mrs. Fletcher, who turned out to be a distant relation of Caleb and Daniel, arrived in late March. She was a formidable woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and hands that had delivered over 200 babies. She took one look at Theodora, nodded approvingly, and pronounced that everything looked as it should. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Could be days yet, could be weeks. We just have to wait and see." The waiting was its own form of torture. Theodora felt like a watched pot, surrounded by anxious men who jumped at her slightest sound. She appreciated their concern, but sometimes longed for the days when she could move about camp without 5 people rushing to help her. On a warm April evening, with the smell of spring rain in the air and the first wildflowers beginning to bloom, Theodora's labor began. It started as a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified into the unmistakable rhythm of contractions. "It is time," she told Owen, her voice remarkably calm despite the fear thrumming beneath her skin. Owen's face went white. "Time, right? Okay, I will get Mrs. Fletcher, and water. We need water, right? And towels, so many towels." "Owen," Theodora said gently, taking his hand, "breathe. I am the one having the baby and I am calmer than you are." "I know," Owen said, forcing himself to take a deep breath. "I know, I am sorry, I want everything to be perfect." "It will be what it will be," Theodora said. "Now go get Mrs. Fletcher." The labor was long and difficult, as first labors often are. Mrs. Fletcher was a calm, commanding presence, guiding Theodora through the pain with the assurance of long experience. Owen stayed by his wife's side, holding her hand, offering water and encouragement. Looking increasingly haggard as the hours stretched on outside the cabin, the rest of the crew waited with the restless energy of men who could not help and did not know what to do with themselves. Pete paced. Tommy cleaned his rifle 3 times. The Fletcher brothers played cards without paying attention to their hands. Henry made coffee no one drank and prayed silently to a god he was not sure he still believed in. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky pink and gold when the baby finally arrived. Theodora gave one last tremendous push, feeling like she was being torn in half, and then suddenly there was a new sound in the world. A thin, angry wail that announced the arrival of a new life. "A boy," Mrs. Fletcher announced, holding up the squalling infant. "You have a son." Owen stared at the baby, at this tiny person who had not existed in the world a moment ago and now was the center of it, and felt tears streaming down his face. "A son," he repeated wonderingly. "Mrs. Fletcher cleaned the baby efficiently and wrapped him in soft blankets, then placed him in Theodora's arms. Theodora looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and tiny fists waving furiously, and fell instantly, irrevocably in love. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one. We have been waiting for you." "He is perfect," Owen said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are both perfect." They had discussed names throughout the winter, never quite settling on one. But looking at their son, Owen said, "What about Jacob, after your father?" Theodora looked up at him with tears in her eyes. She had not mentioned her father often, the German immigrant who had worked himself to death building a life in Ohio before she was 10. "Jacob," she said. "Yes, Jacob Irving." "Welcome to the world, Jacob Irving," Owen said, gently touching his son's cheek. You have no idea what you are in for." When Mrs. Fletcher finally allowed the crew to visit, they trooped in with the solemnity of men entering a church. They gathered around the bed, these rough cowboys, and looked at the baby with the kind of awe usually reserved for miracles. "Well, I will be," Henry said softly. "A real live baby." "What did you think it would be?" Theodora asked, amused. "I do not know. Just had not really processed it, I guess." Henry reached out a gnarled finger, and Jacob wrapped his tiny hand around it, gripping with surprising strength. "Look at that. He is strong already." Pete declared himself Uncle Pete on the spot and promised to teach Jacob to rope when he was old enough. Tommy swore he would whittle the best toys a boy ever had. The Fletcher brothers debated whether Jacob looked more like Owen or Theodora, and concluded he looked mostly like a small, angry old man, which was apparently a compliment. The first weeks of parenthood were a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Jacob had powerful lungs and used them frequently. Theodora learned to nurse while half asleep. Owen learned to change diapers, walk a colicky baby, and function on 2 hours of sleep a night. But through the exhaustion, there was a joy that transformed everything. Jacob's first smile, a real smile, not just gas, made Owen declare it the best moment of his life. The way Jacob would quiet when Theodora sang to him, the way his eyes tracked movement, the tiny sounds he made, all of it was endlessly fascinating. Spring turned to summer. The cattle operation resumed in earnest, but now with the added dimension of a family to consider. Theodora no longer cooked for the crew. They had hired a proper camp cook, a grizzled man named Bill who made excellent biscuits and asked no questions. Theodora's job now was being a mother, though she still helped with camp management and accounts. Owen built an addition onto the cabin, expanding it into a proper house with separate rooms. A nursery for Jacob, a real bedroom for him and Theodora, a kitchen where Theodora could cook for her family. It was still rough by the standards of the East, but it was home. One evening in late summer, Owen and Theodora sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls gold and crimson. Jacob slept in his mother's arms, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. "You remember when we met?" Theodora asked quietly. "When you came looking for a cook and found me crying over a foreclosure notice. I remember thinking you were the strongest person I had ever met," Owen said. "Crying, yes, but not broken, never broken." "I felt broken," Theodora admitted. "After Samuel died, after the debts came due, I felt like I had been shattered into pieces I would never get back together." "But you did," Owen said, taking her free hand. "You put yourself back together, and you were so much stronger than you knew." "We put each other back together," Theodora corrected. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a reason to keep going." "You gave me a home," Owen said. "A real home, not just a place to sleep between cattle drives. You gave me a family. You gave me everything that matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear. Jacob stirred and made a small sound, and Theodora shifted him slightly, rocking gently. "You think we will have more?" Owen asked. "More children, maybe," Theodora said with a smile. "Ask me again when this one is sleeping through the night." The years passed with the patient rhythm of a life well lived. Jacob grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy boy who rode before he could write, and could rope a calf by the time he was 6. The cattle operation expanded, requiring Owen to hire more men and acquire more land. They built a larger house, a proper ranch house with glass windows, and a parlor where Theodora could receive the occasional visitor. 2 years after Jacob was born, they had a daughter they named Sarah, after Owen's mother. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn determination. 2 years after that came another boy, Matthew, who was placid and easy compared to his siblings. Theodora's cabin in South Pass City, the one Owen had saved from foreclosure, was rented to a young couple starting their own lives in Wyoming. The rent provided a small but steady income, and Theodora liked knowing that the cabin Samuel had painted with blue shutters was giving another family a fresh start. The crew that had been there at the beginning remained, forming the core of what became one of the most successful cattle operations in Wyoming territory. Pete eventually married a widow from South Pass City and built a house on the edge of Owen's land. The Fletcher brothers became partners in the operation, buying a share with money they had saved over years of hard work. Henry grew old gracefully, eventually retiring to a small house in town where he spent his days telling stories to anyone who would listen. Tommy, the youngest of the original crew, proved to have a gift for business. He managed the financial side of the operation, keeping books and negotiating deals with the kind of shrewd intelligence that made Owen grateful he had hired a kid with a jokes and an easy smile all those years ago. On their 10th anniversary, Owen took Theodora back to South Pass City, to the same church where they had been married. They renewed their vows in front of their children and the community they had become part of, promising again the love that had sustained them through everything. "I did not know," Theodora said that night as they lay in bed in the hotel where they had spent their wedding night, "when you rode up to my cabin looking for a cook, that you would save my life." "I did not save your life," Owen protested. "You saved your own life." "I just offered you an opportunity." "You offered me hope," Theodora corrected, "when I had none, and hope made all the difference." "You gave me hope too," Owen said. "Hope that life could be more than just work and survival. Hope that I could have a real home, a real family. Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "We built it together," Theodora said firmly. "That is what marriage is, building something together that neither of us could have built alone." They returned to the ranch the next day, to the children who had been staying with Pete and his wife, to the cattle and the land and the life they had made. The house rang with the chaos of 3 children competing for attention, and Theodora laughed as she refereed a dispute between Sarah and Matthew over a toy horse. Owen stood in the doorway, watching his family, and thought about the long path that had brought him here. The losses and struggles, the fears and triumphs, the moment when a desperate cowboy had ridden up to a cabin with blue shutters looking for a cook, and found instead the woman who would become his whole world. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was finally quiet, Owen and Theodora stood on their porch looking at the stars. The Wyoming sky spread above them like a promise, vast and eternal, full of light. "Thank you," Owen said quietly. "For what?" Theodora asked. "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a cowboy you did not know. For building this life with me." "Thank you for giving me a reason to say yes," Theodora replied. "For seeing me when I felt invisible. For loving me when I felt unlovable." "Always," Owen said, pulling her close. "For as long as I have breath in my body, I will love you." "And I will love you," Theodora promised, "in this life and whatever comes after." They stayed there in the darkness, wrapped in each other and the quiet certainty of their love, while inside the house their children dreamed and around them the ranch settled into night. The cattle grazed peacefully in the canyon that had once been a refuge and was now a home. The horses drowsed in the barn. The land that had tested them and shaped them stretched out in all directions, beautiful and harsh and endlessly possibility. It was not the life either of them had imagined in their youth. It was better. It was real and hard and precious, built from loss and hope and the kind of love that grew stronger with time rather than fading. They had started as a cowboy who needed a cook and a widow who needed hope, and they had found something neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. They had found each other. They had found home. They had found a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives, as constant as the Wyoming sky and as deep as the land itself. And in the end, that was everything that mattered. The years continued to unfold, bringing the joys and sorrows that comprise any life fully lived. Jacob grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the ranch's daily operations. Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son, staying close enough that Theodora could visit her grandchildren regularly. Matthew, the quietest of the three, surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, bringing education to ranch children across the county. Owen's hair turned gray, then white, but his hands remained steady and his devotion to Theodora never wavered. Theodora aged gracefully, her face gaining lines that spoke of laughter and sun and a life spent outdoors. But her eyes remained the same gray Owen remembered from that first day, still holding intelligence and strength and the kind of love that made everything worthwhile. They grew old together on the land they had claimed and worked and loved. They sat on their porch in the evenings, hands joined, watching the sun set behind the same mountains they had watched for decades. They told stories to their grandchildren, tales of the early days, of storms survived and dangers faced, and how a cowboy looking for a cook had found a widow looking for hope. And together, they had built something that would outlast them both. And when Owen finally passed, decades after that first meeting, he died as he had lived the best years of his life, with Theodora's hand in his and love surrounding him. Theodora grieved him as she had once grieved Samuel, but this grief was different. It was the grief of completion rather than interruption, the sorrow of a story finished rather than abandoned mid-sentence. She lived several years more, surrounded by children and grandchildren, still offering wisdom and love to all who sought it. And when her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, a small smile on her face as if greeting someone beloved who had been waiting. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the canyon, beneath markers that bore simple inscriptions. Owen Irving, beloved husband and father. Theodora Dalton Irving, beloved wife and mother. But the real monument to their love was not stone. It was the ranch that continued to thrive under Jacob's management, passing to yet another generation. It was the family that gathered every summer for reunions, keeping alive the stories of the couple who had started it all. It was the love that had transformed two broken people into something whole and lasting and beautiful. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains and the stars emerged one by one, the descendants of Owen and Theodora would stand on that same porch where their ancestors had stood, would look out at the same land, and would understand that some loves are not bound by time or mortality. Some loves echo through generations, shaping and defining and inspiring long after those who felt them first have returned to dust. Owen Irving had needed a cook. Theodora Dalton had needed hope. Together, in the wild and beautiful land of Wyoming Territory in the year 1878, they had found something far more precious. They had found love, home, family, and a future that stretched beyond anything either had dreamed possible. And that, in the end, was the story worth telling. Not just of survival in a harsh land, but of thriving. Not just of need, but of fulfillment. Not just of two people finding each other, but of building something eternal from the temporary materials of human life. It was a story of the West, true, but more than that, it was a story of hope realized, of second chances seized, of love that conquered not through grand gestures but through daily choice and commitment. The cowboy had needed a cook. The widow had needed hope. Together they found something more, something that lasted not just a lifetime but generations, echoing through time like a song that never quite fades, reminding all who heard it that love, real love, is the most powerful force in any frontier, the one thing that can transform wilderness into home and strangers into family.